Welcome to Devils in the Details. I am your host, Annie DeGraw. Today, we are talking about the future of transportation infrastructure. Joining us to talk about that, we have Ram Pendyala. Ram is the director of the School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment, as well as the director of Teaching Old Models, New Tricks, or TomNET at ASU. We know transportation and the way that we use it has changed significantly over the last year. How are those changed behaviors going to affect the future of transportation, particularly as transportation becomes more interconnected and smarter? Ram, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get started, tell our viewers, what is TomNET? And having it at ASU, what does that mean for us? What research is happening there?
TomNET is a university transportation center. So the U.S. Department of Transportation funds and sponsors dozens of university transportation centers. And these transportation centers were essentially established to advance the future of transportation, really undertake cutting-edge research that can be transitioned into practice that will actually have an impact on the ground and make a difference in people's lives. These university transportation centers are also meant to really advance the workforce. So to advance a well-trained workforce, to enhance just the pool of individuals who choose transportation as a career, and to diversify the workforce and to recognize that transportation is a very multidisciplinary field that really benefits from having people from all walks of life and all backgrounds engaged in planning our transportation system. So TomNET is one of those university transportation centers. It is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Transportation, and we're really studying the future of mobility. We're trying to understand how people use the transportation system. And as the transportation system evolves and changes with new technologies and new mobility services and all kinds of new things that we're seeing in our transportation landscape, what is the future of mobility going to look like? And what does that mean in terms of the transportation infrastructure investments that we need to be thinking about? Where do our priorities lie? And how do we steer scarce dollars towards infrastructure enhancements?
And I want to talk more about where those investments need to go later on. But next question is, we've seen more interconnection between all of our different modes of transportation, whether you're getting on a car or a train or a bus. How do you see the future of transportation changing? And how is transportation really the driver behind our daily lives?
Transportation is very pervasive in everything we do. Of course, transportation allows us to travel and get from point A to point B and go about engaging in activities that are all distributed in time and space. At the same time, transportation is what delivers goods and services to us. And we've seen that play an amazingly important role over the past year and a half, especially during the pandemic, when we've all depended on lots of goods and services being delivered to us, especially when stores and other entities were operating in limited capacity or were closed completely. And so the transportation system is what makes our supply chains function, is what brings goods and services to factories, to households, to businesses. And people are able to engage in activities, whether it be work or completely a social recreation, visiting friends and family. It's what really keeps our lives going, and really makes our economy thrive. So transportation is woven into our fabric. And that's why when we talk about cities and we talk about people's ability to access destinations and opportunities, transportation is always front and center in that conversation.
And I think people, transportation, sort of la-di-da, that's something in our daily lives. But if you'll remember, just a few short months ago, all we could talk about was a boat being stuck in the Suez Canal and how it held up all of our transportation infrastructure. So Question for you. You mentioned investments, infrastructure, and the investments in infrastructure are at the forefront of most national conversations right now as the administration looks to do a large infrastructure plan. In your opinion, where are dollars best spent right now to help upgrade our infrastructure in the transportation sector?
That is a very tough question to answer because, as you mentioned, our transportation system is very multidimensional, right? There's multiple modes of transportation. There's multiple elements that define a transportation system. There's new technologies and new mobility services that are coming online every day as we speak. So there's really lots of places where transportation could use investments and could make a difference in people's lives and in the economy. So it's really somewhat context dependent. I can't say that it's one size fits all. So you should just invest in fixing bridges that are structurally deficient, or filling the potholes wherever those are problematic. So but there's needs across the board, and that's why you really need a multi-dimensional approach to tackling the transportation infrastructure problem. You certainly need investments in roads and bridges and highways, but you also need investments in new technology and really leveraging new technology to make our transportation system more efficient, to optimize the transportation networks that we depend on. Investments in our supply chain. So investing in intermodal terminals, investing in ports is absolutely critical. Trade, both domestic and international, is only growing by leaps and bounds. Freight movements, again, are just growing tremendously. How are you going to get all of these goods and services efficiently handled and managed and throughput all of the ports and intermodal terminals transferred from one mode of transportation to another very efficiently unless you have invested in port capacity and port operations, and again, fully leveraged technology to make those operations as efficient as possible. So it's really hard to say, here's our top priority. That's why transportation is such a complex problem, and it's really hard to get everybody to agree, right? Everybody agrees transportation is important. Everybody agrees we should invest in transportation. Where we often find ourselves stuck and sometimes going in circles is really trying to understand, well, what are the priorities and how much do you spend on each element of the transportation system?
Absolutely. I think people, if you really drill down on it, it's hard to think, but that drones transporting goods to boats transporting goods to high speed rail to highways out in the middle of rural America, all under the transportation banner. So, absolutely hard to get people around one idea there. Question for you. You have been in this field for a number of years. What are some of the most interesting patterns or behavior in transportation that you found in your research?
That's an interesting question. Our research heavily focuses on behavior, on human travel behavior. So most of my work has been trying to understand how, when, where, and why people travel the way they do. Because every time people travel, they're using the transportation infrastructure. That is the traffic, that is the demand that's being placed on our transportation infrastructure, and that can help guide future investments and technology enhancements for the transportation system. It's fascinating to study human travel behavior and travel demand and try to forecast and predict how travel demand will evolve into the future. And so it's surprising in some ways to see, for example, how difficult it is to change travel behavior. So, for example, for decades, we have had all types of incentives and special programs to promote ride sharing, to promote carpooling. We have dedicated lanes for carpooling. And we have, lots of agencies offer special ride sharing programs and so on. And despite all of those efforts, it's amazing that we have made absolutely no progress in increasing the share of trips that involve carpooling or vehicle ride sharing. So it is amazing that, so you do so much, and yet it's very hard to change human travel behavior. On the other hand, it's also amazing to see how easy it is to change human travel behavior. If you look at literally what's happened over the past 15 to 16 months, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that travel patterns and how people have accessed goods and services and undertaken activities has dramatically changed. And so it seems like when we want to change our behavior, we certainly can.
So I think we're talking about the stubbornness of humanity, perhaps, at this point. So again, transportation covers a wide range of different research topics. Ram, I want to thank you so much for joining us today to talk about transportation and how it's rapidly changing. And to our viewers, until next time, thank you for joining us on Devils in the Details. Stay safe.